So we're going to get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Francois J. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club at Fletcher. And I'd like to welcome you today to our event with Dr. Cyril Hovorun on the topic of the Orthodox Church and European dictatorships in the 20th century. Before I hand it over to Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, who is the head of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, and the advisor to the club of our RLD at Fletcher, I'd like to quickly note to everyone that this past October, we had a very successful conference on the topic of Ukraine on religion, geopolitics, and pluralism in Eurasia, and that will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in short order. And also, I'd like to highlight that in the spring, we will be having a panel series on the topic of religion and peace building, which will be starting in mid-February, and we'll have one panel every 2 weeks. So we hope that you will keep that on your radar and hopefully join us in the spring. And the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club really focuses on providing a framework for interdisciplinary study and the practice of international affairs through the lens of religious literacy. And that's what we've done through our conferences, through our panel series, and what we will do today through our event. So I will hand it over to Professor Prodromou, and she will introduce our speaker formally.
Great. Thank you, Francois, and thank you for welcoming everyone. On behalf of the club and the initiative, it's great to have everyone here, and it's a pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Reverend Dr. Cyril Hovorun, who is at the moment in Kyiv, Ukraine. So in keeping with our Ukrainian orientation of this fall semester, it's wonderful to have you with us, Dr. Hovorun, and I want to say a little bit about your really interesting and cross-disciplinary bio and set of experiences and expertise for our listeners. Dr. Hovorun is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at St. Ignatius College in Stockholm, at the Stockholm School of Theology in Stockholm. He's also a graduate of the Theological Academy of Kyiv and the National University in Athens. So we've got Sweden, Ukraine, and Greece already. He completed his doctoral studies at Durham University under the supervision of the very well-known and internationally respected Father Andrew Louth. Dr. Hovorun was also chairman of the Department for External Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and he also served as first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I believe you completed research at Yale and Columbia universities as a visiting fellow there. You've held a visiting professorship at the University of Munster in Germany. You've also been an international fellow in Canada at the University of Alberta. And most recently, you were the director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute in California at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And I believe professor at the same university. And I think you may be moving to a new appointment, if you want to tell us about that. Dr. Hovorun, Reverend Dr. Hovorun, Father Dr. Hovorun, he has published multiple books. He's prolific in many languages, including Sacred Architecture in East and West, Political Orthodoxies, the Unorthodoxies of the Church Coerced, and Scaffolds of the Church towards post-structural ecclesiology. So it's really a pleasure to welcome you here as a theologian who, in the words of the late great development economist Albert Hirschman, you happily trespass disciplinary boundaries. And that's what the initiative on our Religion, Law, and Diplomacy is about. So we look forward to hearing you today and welcoming you virtually and soon, hopefully in person.
Thank you so much, Professor Prodromou, and my sincere thanks also to the club. I was really fascinated when I learned that your club exists, and it's a wonderful initiative. Especially, it is important, and I'm fascinated by it, and it's important for me because my field concentrates on the same cross-section between diplomacy and religion and international relations. So I'm really thrilled to be here virtually, even though when we discussed this possibility of my coming to Boston, I was supposed to be physically in Boston and to present at the club, but well, in our times we cannot choose to travel this way. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me for your discussion, and I hope we will have a productive conversation. Yes, so shall I start?
Of course, absolutely.
Yes, good.
The floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Good, right. That's right. So the topic of my conversation today will be the Orthodox contribution or participation in the European dictatorships in the 20th century. When we're speaking about the dictatorships in the 20th century, we usually keep in our minds two major ideological systems that clashed, especially in the first half of the 20th century: communism and Nazism, two major ideologies that shaped two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the Nazis Germany. And those are somehow paradigmatic, archetypical dictatorships, as it were, based on ideologies. And indeed, the Orthodox churches contributed to those dictatorships. Probably not to the same extent as maybe some Protestant churches, like if you take into consideration Deutsche Christen, the German Christians in Germany, mostly Protestant and Reformed Christians who constituted a body, political and ecclesial to some extent body that supported the Nazi regime, or if we take into consideration a very controversial and still debated contribution of the Vatican, of the Roman Catholic Church to the developments in Germany and in Italy, another notorious dictatorship at the time with Mussolini's fascist system, which was also somehow corroborated by Christians, Western Christians. So the contribution of the Orthodox to those two or three regimes, if we add Italy to that, was really minor, hardly distinguishable. Still, there were some words and gestures and symbolic gestures from the Orthodox churches to endorse somehow the programs or ideological directions of those regimes. Like, for instance, a part of the Russian church at the time, the so-called Drolet Russian church outside Russia, which separated from the Moscow Patriarchate after the Bolshevik Revolution 1917, and which clearly aligned with the monarchical, conservative, traditionalist agendas in the interwar period, endorsed Hitler personally. Well, one of those episodes, which was not systematic, I would say. It was not a systematic endorsement of the Nazi regime. It happened when Hitler okayed building a new cathedral for the Rokor in Berlin. And actually, this church, the main church for this Russian church, was built with a significant contribution from the funds of Reich's chancellery. With Reich's money, and the primate of the church, Metropolitan Anastasius, thanked Hitler personally for that contribution. There were other episodes, like, for instance, when during the German occupation of Greece, like Mount Athos was under the German occupation, and many monks on Mount Athos, who are famous for their spiritual life, nevertheless endorsed and collaborated with the occupation forces and so forth. So there were some instances of collaboration between the Orthodox churches and Nazis. The same was in the Soviet Union, and even though in the Soviet Union the Russian church dominated the scene, as it were, its contribution to the Soviet ideology or regime was really minor. The Russian church was persecuted; it was on the brink of extinction, especially under Stalin, and the only strategy of survival for that church, so many believed at the time, was just to accept whatever the state does to the church, which meant that the church just really humiliated or wanted to exterminate the church. So the Russian church did not have a choice whether to deliberately support the Soviet regime or not to support it, at least officially. Well, some people in the Russian church just chose to go underground and join different sects. Orthodox sects underground. Some just went to gulags and perished there. Well, thousands, hundreds of thousands of them perished there. The official church, at least that part that remained alive after the persecution of after the Great Terror by Stalin, chose to collaborate with the Soviet state. And again, it was not a marriage by agreement. It was a cursed marriage, arranged marriage between the church and the state, as it were. And again, the Russian church, the Russian state, the Soviet state, did not need any endorsement from the church, from the Russian church. So as the Nazi regime did not need any endorsement from from those pieces of the Orthodox churches that found themselves on the territories controlled by the Nazis. A bit different situation is in some minor spots of Europe at the time, which are somehow understudied and remain under the shadow of those big political or ideological systems of communism and Nazism and Italian fascism at the time. Those are the spots in Europe which coincided historically with the area of orthodoxy, of Eastern Christianity, and which adopted dictatorship for the political regime. Those are minor dictatorships that flourished in some small Eastern or Southern European countries. Those dictatorships are less known than Nazi Germany or Italy or the Soviet Union, but still they played an important role in the political developments in Europe at the time. They constituted an important part of the landscape, of the political landscape in Europe, as it were. Fortunately, we have now a number of good studies of those, I call them minor dictatorships in Eastern and Southern Europe. They appeared recently, and I'd like to show you some books which explore those minor dictatorships. Like this one, like Rethinking Fascism and Dictatorship in Europe, with focus on those small dictatorships, like in Portugal, like in Spain, which continued into the 70s, as we know, and in some Orthodox countries, like in Romania, like in Greece. And there is another book, also by Paul Gray Macmillan. This is the publisher. Its title is Reactionary Nationalist Fascists and Dictatorships in the 20th Century. And there are some other books that cover those small dictatorships in Europe, which were sitting deeply in the Orthodox soil, as it were, or traditional Eastern Christian soil, and which collaborated with the big dictatorships. Like, for instance, I just want to show you another book. It's called Hitler's Forgotten Ally. It's about the dictator in Romania in the war period, Ion Antonescu. So I suggest we focus on those minor dictatorships, because the contribution of the Orthodox churches to the evolution, to the flourishing of those dictatorships was very significant, much more significant than the contribution of the Orthodox churches to the Nazi regime or communist regime, or there was almost nothing in terms of the contribution of the Orthodox churches to Italian fascism, but there was a very important contribution of the Orthodox churches to other forms of fascism in Europe at the time. Essentially, the Orthodox churches provided those small, minor fascist regimes, dictatorships, with important tools of self-reflection and self-expression. They provided those regimes with narratives, ideologies, kind of ideologies tuned or tailored to fit the national ground in those dictatorships. I will not go into details regarding those small dictatorships and how the churches collaborated with them. I just want to suggest a book that I published on this subject, and Elizabeth mentioned it. It's Political Orthodoxies. And I actually explore here cases of collaboration of the Orthodox churches with the dictatorships in Greece and in Romania, as well as in the pre-revolutionary Russia, I mean, before the revolution, 1917, and the collaboration of the church with the Soviet regime. So you can find more details about this collaboration here. What I want to do in this kind of short presentation that I'm supposed to make it short is to epitomize the common features of the collaboration between the Orthodox churches, local Orthodox churches, and those minor dictatorships in Europe, especially in the interwar period, but also in some cases after the World War II, like in Greece, for instance, during the dictatorship of the so-called Black Colonels from 1967 through 1974. So my list of common features of all sorts of dictatorships in Europe, in the Orthodox, traditional Orthodox countries, and how they were supported, endorsed by the Orthodox churches, will start first with the point that the churches, Orthodox churches in those countries, effectively adopted and reproduced fascist rhetorics. Fascism is usually considered almost synonymous with nationalism, and sometimes it is even confused. The most recent scholarship argues that they are not exactly the same, fascism and nationalism, and we should distinguish between fascism and nationalism. And essentially, the churches, Orthodox churches, grew to supporting fascism from nationalism, from the original nationalism, which had been adopted by the churches in the 19th century, in the wake of the so-called the Spring of the Nations, when the new independent national church states emerged from out of the Ottoman Empire, Habsburg Empire, and the Russian Empire eventually after 1917. They emerged as national states. They emerged as nations that fought for their freedom. They were endorsed, those fights for freedom were endorsed by the church, but eventually they transformed, many of them transformed to nationalist kind of regimes and ideologies. And when those superpowers, ideological superpowers like Nazi Germany and Soviet Union emerged, many of them aligned themselves, those kind of nationalistic churches and states aligned themselves with the fascist ideologies which were fashionable in the interwar period. That's how the Orthodox churches grew to support fascist regimes, because it looked very similar to their original nationalist ideologies, even though, again, I want to point it out that we should not confuse them completely, because a feature of fascism is not just national identity developed to an extreme, but also an emphasis on the role of the state and on the role of masses against or versus vis-a-vis individual beings, individuum. So the collectivism and etatism became an intrinsic feature of fascism, and quite surprising, it was also a feature of the Soviet ideology, because the Soviet Union also emphasized the role of the masses against the role of individual beings and the role of the state in promoting, social justice and equality and everything that was on the agenda of the communist ideology. So the churches quite surprisingly support, well, maybe not surprising, but in tune or in line with endorsing fascist regimes and ideologies, supported collectivism versus individualism and supported etatism, the role of the state in the life of the people. Two factors contributed to these two alignments. First, individualism was believed to be a Western construct, and the churches, by adopting an anti-Western rhetoric and ideology in this way, by criticizing the Western individualism, rebuked the West, as they believe, the heretical or a secular West. So it became a part of the anti-Western rhetoric, this endorsement of collectivism. And they endorsed etatism in the wake of the symphonic thinking, because an intrinsic part of the Eastern Christian legacy is alignment with the state, reliance on the state, following the model of symphony between the church and the state in Byzantium. So the churches, the Eastern churches have developed, excuse me, a kind of DNA in their genes, in their nature, which is symphonic, which pushes them, forces them to adopt a relationship with the state, whatever the state is. So this is the root of the etatism, which is a feature of fascism. That's where they converged, fascism and the support of the Eastern churches to the contemporary fascist regimes. Another feature that is common for all the churches that supported fascist regimes in their home countries is what I call Byzantinism. It's a continuation of the romantic perception of the past. That, well, I should make a reference here that nationalist ideology in the 19th century grew from the Romanticism, especially from the German Romanticism, which idealized, the past of a nation. And this past for the Orthodox churches was Byzantium. So this idealization of Byzantium, of the Byzantine past of the churches, contributed to the formation of an ideology which I call Byzantinism. And essentially all major dictatorships in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, they made explicit references to Byzantium. Like, for instance, one of the ideologies of the Romanian dictatorship, who was also Prime Minister of Romania from 1931 to 32, Nicolae Iorga. He was a famous Byzantologist as well. And he is famous for his book, which was written and translated first into French, Byzance après Byzance, Byzantium after Byzantium, where he explored the idea that Byzantium can exist even after Byzantium ceased to exist. And he believed that his contemporary Romania was such a Byzance après Byzance. Also, another dictator, a Greek dictator in the same period of time, Ioannis Metaxas, who was a dictator from 1936 to 1941, he constructed, well, with the assistance of also from people from the church, he constructed an ideology that the Greece that he wanted to see under his leadership, dictatorship essentially, was a continuation of the Hellenic civilization. He called this Greece, his Greece, the third Hellenic civilization. The first one for him was Sparta. Remarkably, not Athens, not the Athenian democracy, but the Spartan regime, because he believed that the Athenian democracy, ancient Athenian democracy, was weak, while the Spartan regime was strong enough and was really an example for modern Greeks, contemporary Greeks. The second, though, civilization for Ioannis Metaxas was Byzantium. So he believed that his dictatorship just continued Byzantium, and it's a natural evolution of the Byzantine civilization, as it were. So those are examples of references to Byzantinism among the dictators in Europe, Orthodox dictators in Europe. And we'll come back to this feature in a moment. I should also, I have identified another common feature among those dictatorships. It is the feature that all those dictatorships perceive themselves and express themselves and believed about themselves, that they are distinct civilizations. They are not just nations, they are whole civilizations. And essentially they dwelt on the concept of civilization as it was developed, had been developed in the beginning of the 20th century by the political scientists and philosophers such as Arnold Toynbee, Kinsey Wright, and others. And they, in their turn, they built their work on the works of Oswald Spengler, a very kind of popular German political philosopher who predicted, he became popular because he predicted the fall of the decline of the West. Also some Russian philosophers, political philosophers, and philosophers of history, such as Lev Gumilev, continue the same line of expressing the lifestyle, the ethos of the of the Eastern Christian countries as distinct civilizations. And Lev Gomilov in particular spoke about super ethnoses, super nations, which are wider than the national core of the national states that emerged in the Balkans in the wake of the collapse of the Balkan empires. Another common feature of all the dictatorships and the churches that endorsed them, that they valued traditional values, what we call now traditional values. So they were essentially conservative entities, and they supported conservative ideologies based on traditional values. They were deeply engaged in the culture wars of those times, the wars between or the battles between ideologies. The kind of liberal and conservative ideologies, well, the sort of the battles that you experience now in the United States, of course, and in Europe, they were particularly acute, those battles in the interwar period, and well, they led to the World War II essentially, because the World War II can be rendered as a battle royale between two major kind of ideological outlooks, a conservative and a liberal one in some sense. And the churches were deeply engaged in those dialogues, just like the churches in the United States nowadays are so deeply involved in the culture battles. So the Orthodox churches were involved in the same sort of culture wars in the 20th century, throughout the 20th century on the European scene. No surprise, they aligned themselves with the conservative side of those culture wars, and they confronted and accused of treason those within the churches who were believed to be liberals. So they essentially tried to to purge the churches from the so-called liberals. So those are the main features of all the Orthodox dictatorships during the 20th century, and it gives an explanation also of those articles on my list. They give an explanation why the churches were so deeply involved in those and supported those dictatorships. Now let me just, in the kind of final part of my presentation, jump to our times. And I would like to highlight that those features, common features of dictatorships and the churches endorsing those dictatorships have not vanished. They reemerge, and they have reemerged in some modern situations. I believe this is the case of what is happening in Russia nowadays. We can, I think, identify clearly those commonalities between the 20th century dictatorships, Orthodox dictatorships, especially interwar dictatorships, and what is happening now in Putin's Russia, and how the Russian church supports Putin's regime. Like, for instance, the Russian Orthodox Church clearly and explicitly stated that it prefers collectivism and etatism over individualism for the sake of rebuking, the Western values in the wake of anti-Westernism that it supports. More clearly, this preference to collectivism over individualism was expressed in the document which was adopted in about 12 years ago. It's a document on the human rights and human dignity, and the document clearly states that the collective rights are more important than individual human rights. So this is a clear indication of this collectivism winning over individualism. Another feature is Byzantinism. It is still, well, it is in Russia. It is on the plate of the Russian kind of regime, and there are some programmatic statements made by the church figures in Russia, like a person, a metropolitan, he's now metropolitan in the western part of Russia, and who is believed to be very close to Putin. He has produced a movie which is called The Fall of an Empire, The Lesson of Byzantium. It's a popular movie. I can send you a link to the chat. I think I can do this. Let me. Where is that? Just give me a second. Yeah. So it is here. So you can, it has been translated also in English, as well as in Chinese and Greek and stuff. So it is a kind of manifesto of Byzantinism in modern Russia. Or just remember how when Putin visited Mount Athos and he was treated there as a Byzantine Basileus. He was placed, into a special seat at the monastery at Mount Athos. So he was presented really like a new Basileus, Byzantine Basileus. So it's another feature of Byzantinism in Russia. And also I should remind you that the rhetoric of the Russian civilization has become very popular in Russia, and it is generated mostly by the church. So the main producer of this rhetoric of a unique Russian civilization is the Russian church. Also, an important part of this rhetoric produced by the church is the rhetoric of the traditional values. Well, most people who speak about the traditional values in Russia nowadays, they believe that they have invented a new thing. It's a kind of a new speech, a new kind of language that they try to capture, the attention of wide audiences in Russia and outside. But it's a very old language, as a matter of fact, and it is particularly a language of the churches and groups within the churches that supported dictatorships during the 20th century. I'd like to show you probably the last book that I want to show you. It's in Greek. It's a book by Christos Yanaras, a Greek modern author. It is titled Καταφύγιον Ιδεών, and this is a book about the so-called brotherhoods in the interwar period and immediately after the World War II. Those were groups of theological groups, very powerful in the Greek church. They were called Zoe, life, and Sotir, the savior. And they were very active in the Greek church. They really dominated the Greek church. And they were very conservative. They had a very conservative agenda, and they endorsed the dictatorships of their time. So it's a kind of, and they endorsed those dictatorships on the basis of the traditional values. They clearly articulated those traditional values. So the roots of the modern language, Russian language of the traditional values, goes at least as far as to those groups, conservative groups in Greece, who had supported their contemporary dictatorships. And the last thing that I want to say about the Russian development is that the ideological divide between conservatives and liberals became so strong in the Russian church that essentially conservatism as an ideological construct has become a new orthodoxy, a new doctrine of the church, almost a new doctrine that substituted somehow the traditional Orthodox doctrine to an extent. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it seems like that. It looks like that people debate. I mean, in the church, there is an internal debate where conservatism is proclaimed as a kind of the new orthodoxy, new doctrine, and everyone who does not comply with this conservative doctrine is deemed to be a sort of heretic. Well, the patriarch called those even clergy who dare to express some liberal ideas as traitors in cassocks, literally. So it's a kind of internal purge against liberals, which is an interesting indication exactly of this ideological obsession with ideologies within the Russian church. The same kind of obsession that the churches in the interwar period, the Orthodox churches, had in the countries like Greece and Romania. So that's my kind of short presentation. I try to be brief, and I want also to leave some time for Q&A.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hovorun. You covered a lot of ground from the Byzantine Empire up to the 21st century. So we have 2,000 years of history that we can dive into. I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question, and then I'll turn it over to the club leadership to sort of pitch more questions at you. And I have many, but I don't want to monopolize the time. I want to push back on a couple of points and ask you for clarification. One is concerns your typology of what you're calling dictatorships. And I know that you differentiated between communism and fascism, but I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how those two alternative forms of totalitarianism were interpreted by, when we say the Orthodox Church, let's say Orthodox thinkers. What were maybe were there? Is there a literature on this that is relatively rich? But the second thing I wanted to ask is about the internal differentiation in each of these national churches, because you mentioned when you talked about ROCOR versus the Patriarchate of Moscow, the kind of coercive, passive relationship between the Patriarchate of Moscow and the Bolshevik regime, and at the same time, millions of people being sent to the Gulag for their dissidence and their faith beliefs. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about internal tensions in these churches, because certainly in terms of the case that I know very well, the Church of Greece, the book you mentioned, Katafio Idion, Refuge of Ideas by Yonaras, it's a sort of an expose of these religious brotherhoods. But one of the things that the book does is to speak about the intense debate within Orthodox churches about how to engage in the public sphere. And those brotherhoods, ironically, were meant to be, they originated as so-called reformist movements, drawing very purposefully and explicitly from the German context where many of the leaders had studied, to renew and revitalize the role of Orthodox churches in the public sphere. So I guess where I'm going with this is, can you say a little bit more about the internal tensions and fractiousness within these various churches? And they differ, of course, according to national context when it comes to their relationship with state authority.
Yeah. Well, that's yes. Well, I have to have another lecture. Probably.
I know. It wasn't a very parsimonious question, so I apologize for being a little all over.
Well, those are fascinating questions, and I try to respond briefly. The Russian church is probably the most divided church during the 20th century over the ideological differences. Exactly. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, there was one single church. After 1917, that one single church split into three churches, essentially, and the split happened along the ideological lines. In 1917, there was not just one revolution, I should remind. There were two revolutions. One was in February 1917, which was a Republican revolution, where the Russian Republic was established. It was very short-lived. It was democratic. It was probably the only period of time in the 20th century when Russia was a democratic state for just a few months after February 1917. Then the Bolshevik coup d'état happened in October 1917, and the Bolshevik established the dictatorship of the proletarians. And essentially, those two revolutions, Russian revolutions of 1917, marked the points of divergence between those three parts of the Russian church. The ROCOR is the church that stayed in the pre-1917 age, as it were. They were, and they are still monarchists. They are royalists. They dream of restoring the Russian monarchy. That is the ROCOR, and they are very conservative in the ideological attitudes. Then there was a faction within the Russian church that endorsed this Republican period of the Russian history. That Republican period of history from February through October 1917 produced the most important event in the recent Russian history of the church, the Great Council of Moscow, 1917-1918, because the Council of Moscow reflected the agenda of the Russian Republic, essentially. And the agenda of that council is Republican to its core. And a faction of the Russian church, which eventually went under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the so-called the Russian Exarchate in Western Europe, is exactly politically, ideologically, the faction close politically and ideologically to the Russian Republic. which lived for several months in 1917. And then we have the Moscow Patriarchate, which complied with the post-November 1917 situation in Russia with the communist regime, essentially. So we have three factions, very kind of irreconcilable with one another for a long time, and still to a great extent irreconcilable even now, and they reflect the ideological divisions in the Russian Church in 1917. And of course, those factions produce their own ideologies, thinkers who try to justify their, theology on the basis of ideology. If you take, for instance, Ivan Ilyin, a philosopher who's a favorite philosopher of Putin, so he says, the guy who actually has justified the monarchical rule. His philosophy, though, it was kind of updated from the usual royalist stuff, because he said that a monarch in Russia can be not necessarily the a Romanov, another Romanov, but can be anyone, but he has to have all power in his hands. That's why I think Putin likes him, because he did not speak about a Romanov, but about any monarch. But the ruler of Russia should be a monarch. So he's justified essentially the theology which was supported by the Rokor to a great extent. Or if you take some other ideologies of the Rokor, like Serafim Sobolev, the archbishop who was canonized recently, he has written a book called Russian Ideology, where he justified why Russia and the Russian Church should be monarchical and should go with the monarchical ideas. On the other hand, we have theologians who try to justify the Soviet regime to a great extent. For instance, it was very hard to do because the Soviet regime was very atheistic, very anti-religious, and still they found some points of convergence between the Orthodox theology and communism. Like they argue that the early Christian communities were communists effectively. Well, it's a very doubtful statement, but at least they try to justify communist regime in this sense. So, and the same kind of justification of left and right ideologies we can find in other countries like Romania and Greece. We can find very kind of liberal thinking theologians in Greece, like for instance Sava Agouridis, a great theologian, passed away recently, and he was almost a communist, kind of Marxist. He was accused of being a Marxist. Or we can find really very conservative thinkers, like some Athonite Gerondas, Theophilus Gerondas from Mount Athos, for instance, who endorsed the regime of the Black colonels. So in Romania, for instance, we can find thinkers who completely endorsed the Romanian fascism and even Nazism, like a prominent theologian of the interwar period, Nikifor Krajnik. He, in line with the German anti-Semitism, and it's another feature of many dictatorships, they were anti-Semitic. For instance, he argued that Jesus Christ could not be a Jew. And he was exactly in the line with the liberal Protestant theologians of Nazi Germany, who tried to substantiate the point that Christ could not be a Jew. So we can find Romanian confederates, Orthodox confederates, theologians who try to support the same ideas. So there was a variety of theologies in this period of time during the 20th century. But the problem is that most of those theologians and theologians, they were so much biased ideologically, they reflected ideological agendas of their states.
Thank you. I just have one footnote observation, and then I'll hand it over to the club leadership. One of the things that I think is very interesting about methodologically about what you're presenting to us, and also theoretically, is that the internal debates over theology have enormous political consequences, and we see this in cross-comparative studies of religion, regardless of what tradition. And I think, seeing that in the case of the Orthodox Church sort of situates the Orthodox Church as part of contemporary debates on Islam, on Roman Catholicism, etc. And I think that's worth pointing out. And then finally, I would say that having been at the council at Crete, the Holy and Great Council at Crete, which 4 churches, including Moscow, boycotted, it was very interesting to see those 3 theological tendencies of what I would call fundamentalism, conservatism, and progressivism on display there, and a really robust debate about, I think, the three factors that you discussed, in particular, individualism, and a move beyond this individualism equals Westernism dyad to this theological concept of the person, and then the church-state questions, and those who would err on the side of the Byzantine Symphony, and those who, quite thankfully from my perspective, remind everyone there's no emperor, so that's really not, a model that means anything today. And then finally, your notion of sort of remembrance of the past versus glorification of the past, and those were certainly on full display among the 10 national churches that were there. So just a footnote to your work, which I think is just fascinating. And thank you for the indulgence of the comment too, and from the students who I now throw it over to take full control.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So we have a couple questions coming from the audience, so I'll read one of them, and then I'll go over to some of my other club members, and they'll do the same. And for those who came in a little late, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club. I'm Francois. So the first question we have is from Constantine. His question is, how does the post-Nicodemus ideology of the modern Russian Orthodox Church influence relations with dictatorial regime?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Well, you are meaning, of course, Nicodim Rotov, the famous Metropolitan of Leningrad, who is the great, well, he is a spiritual mentor of the present patriarch, of course, and he is to a great extent the person who is responsible for the almost entire top hierarchy of the Russian Church. Even now, he passed away quite early when he was 49 years old, but he managed in his short life to make a new kind of, he created the church as we know now, the Russian Church, essentially. And it's interesting. I think if we want to find answers to the question how and why the Russian Church does what it does now, we need to go back to Nicodim, because what is happening now in Russia is, to a great extent, is a fulfillment of the ideals of Nicodim. Nicodim was among those persons who believed that it's providential that the Russian Church happened in the setting of the communist regime, and he tried to reconcile the existence of the Russian Church with the communist regime. Well, some people say it's very speculative, but they say that he was originally in the communist kind of, with the communist preset in his mind, and he came to the church, and he discovered the church, and he tried to reconcile the church and theology with the communist ideology. And essentially, he believed that yes, that Christianity is compatible to some extent with communism. He believed that communism can provide the church with not just with challenges, but also with opportunities. And he tried to, to realize those opportunities. I think he was a guy who was responsible for the external policy of the Russian Church. He went often to the conferences, international fora, and he presented the position of the Russian Church and was and advocated for the position of the Soviet state in those fora. And I believe he did it sincerely, not just pretending to advocate those positions. He really believed what he said. At the same time, he hoped that he could outsmart the state, that the church can be smarter, can be more flexible, adaptable to the realities, and could benefit from the state by cheating the state. I believe this is to a great extent the policies of the present church. The church tries to outsmart the state. So it's not just those rosy symphonic relations between the church and the state in the modern Russia. It's far from truth. The relations are very complicated, and they follow the line of Nicodim. When there is a power struggle between the church and the state, when the church and the state try to cheat one another and to use one another for their own purposes, it continues the line of Nicodim to a great extent. That's why I believe it is. Yes, and of course, Nicodim, I believe that you can cooperate with any regime. Either it is dictatorship. His own experience was that his experience was only the dictatorship of the Soviet Union. he never lived in, he never experienced, he never knew what is democracy. And that was the only experience that he had. And he believed the church can survive within a dictatorship. Moreover, the church should not close itself within a shell within a dictatorship, but should cooperate, open up to dictatorship, and should cooperate with the dictatorship, actually with any dictatorships. That's why, well, he was traveling to the dictatorships, which were satellite of the Soviet Union throughout the world, and felt at home there.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I hope, Konstantin, if you're still there, that it was a satisfying answer. We also had a question in the Q&A about just a request about the second title, the book, one of the second books that you showed.
Yes, I'm sure I don't remember which was second. I'll show them again. Right. Well, this was the first book, I believe.
Oh, the second one was Reactionary Nationalism, Fascism, and Dictatorship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
This one is by Paul Gray Macmillan. I think it's very recent.
Okay, great. So I hope whoever asked that can write that down. So I'm going to hand it over to Shelby, who will ask the next question.
Hi, I'm yet another member of the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club, and a question that came to the chat from RJ Fox was about those individual, more liberal priests in modern Russia that you mentioned. He wanted to know if they're completely silent, if they've been able to gather together for support, or just kind of if they've been able to advocate for themselves within the system.
Yeah. Well, I believe they've been completely silenced. They don't speak up. They don't go public. Well, I should say that the censorship is very, very tough in the Russian church, the internal censorship. There are some very open-minded priests and thinkers in the Russian church, but they are really afraid of their positions. They don't want to go public, and they just keep their conversations private, their critical conversations private. There are some public figures who went open, into the open confrontation with the ideological line of the Russian church nowadays, but they've been marginalized. They don't have any official position. They are like dissidents, and essentially the culture of dissidents has come back now to the church, to the Russian church. Once upon a time, maybe you may recall that once upon a time Putin said that the church used to be the only dissident group, legal dissident group in the Soviet Union. That was the word of these were the words of Putin. And indeed, the church was a kind of a harbor for many dissidents in the Soviet era. Nowadays, the church essentially oppresses dissidents within its own setting. That is a kind of a very new development in the church.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben. I have another question. So this one comes from Vladimir Narcia, and he asked, can you talk a little bit more about Stalin's religious policy towards the Russian Orthodox Church since 1943? And a follow-up, was it a time when the church started explicitly supporting dictatorship?
Yeah, well, some rather radical voices say that Stalin essentially reestablished the Russian church, and the Russian church that exists now has been established by Stalin. I think it's a kind of an overestimation. It's a very biased statement, but certainly Stalin allowed the church to exist. It had almost disappeared by 1943. Well, there are different speculations why Stalin decided to do so. Maybe he felt that with the losses of the World War II, the people had to have some kind of consolation. Maybe he himself, after all, he was a former seminarian, a student in a religious school. He was supposed to be a priest. He was trained for a priest. Maybe something from his youth reemerged in his soul. No one knows. Different speculations circulate around this. But the matter of fact is that he allowed the church to exist, but within a very narrow corridor of possibilities. That was the corridor of international policies. Stalin, especially after the World War II, began building a global Soviet kind of quasi-empire, as we know, fulfilling the vision of the global international to a great extent, and he needed the church to this end, particularly the countries which were traditionally Orthodox, like in the Eastern Europe, in Southern Europe, and in the Middle East. He just instrumentalized the church to that end of pursuing people in those countries which he wanted to include to his sphere of influence, to look favorably at the Soviet Union. Many people were afraid in the Middle East and South and Eastern Europe that the anti-religious policies of the Soviet Union were too horrible. They could not digest them, and Stalin decided to at least to present the religious policy of the Soviet Union as milder, as more kind of digestible by the regimes and the people in the countries that he wanted to include to his sphere of influence. We should not forget that even Greece, he had his eye on Greece, Stalin, and he wanted to include Greece to his sphere of interest. So people in Greece would have never accepted the kind of persecution against the church that Stalin had promoted before the World War II. So he needed a new picture of the Soviet Union projected to the potential clients of the Soviet Union, and he used the church, instrumentalized the church to project this picture.
Thanks. I'll pass it back to Francois now.
Great, thank you. So just coordinating one question with someone else. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask one of my own questions. So I had a question about the collectivism aspect that you mentioned, the commonality. So in terms of focusing less on the individual and more on the collective society, how did the Orthodox dictatorships view the EU, for example, during the 20th century, which is about focusing less on the states' rights and more about the collective, like European identity in a sense? Because it seems as if the collectivism is almost a restrictive collectivism to their particular group. So I'm wondering, how did they view that similar idea on a grander scale, and was about individual rights versus continental unity?
Yes, I believe there were different forms of collectivism at the time. If we take the Soviet collectivism, it was a collectivism of the class of the proletarians, which had to dominate the individual and the other classes. The collectivism of Nazis, it was a collectivism of a race. The collectivism which was very familiar to the Orthodox countries, it was a collectivism of nations, of those particular nations that you mentioned. Therefore, the church was was familiar, was accustomed to collectivism in the form of nationalism, of national identity. At least after the parade of independences in the 19th century. That's why I believe the church easily switched to other forms of collectivism, starting with or building on the church's experience of national collectivism, when the nation mattered everything. Everyone had to sacrifice him or herself to a nation. That was the kind of romantic ideology of the national awakening and national liberation movements, from starting with 1821, the Greek Revolution of Liberation.
Thank you.
So very quickly, we have a follow-up question from RJ's original question about the individual, more liberal priests in modern Russia. My apologies, her pronouns are she, her, hers, and that was my mistake in not confirming that. But she wanted to know, would those individual, more liberal priests be able to leave the church and establish a conference of their own, probably thinking sort of in the strains of autocephaly of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, probably because those more liberal priests or figures in the Russian church, they believe in individual kind of values. They follow individual paths in supporting and promoting those values. That's why some of them just stopped speaking publicly. Some of them emigrated if they could abroad, and they continue writing and speaking abroad. Some of them have been silenced or even defrocked. So there are, and they just, they continue speaking, but as in the capacity of not clergymen anymore, as it were. So those are different ways of, for those people, but certainly they don't feel at home. They don't feel that they can speak freely and without retaliation, which is very contrary to the original expectation when the present patriarch became the patriarch. The expectations were just the opposite, because he was a liberal thinker. And as a matter of fact, it is a very strange thing. Speaking about Nicodemus, who is the father of all the kind of top hierarchs until now, all those people who are believed to be disciples of Nicodemus, including the previous patriarch Alexei and other figures, they are intrinsically liberal in their thinking, but they always had to play conservatives. They never could show themselves openly that they are liberal, probably because of the problems of reception, because the people, faithful people in Russia would not digest, would not stomach, liberal hierarchs on top of them. But in the depth of their souls, they are liberal. The same as the patriarch, current patriarch. He was probably the most outspoken liberal hierarch in the Russian church. And what happened? He just, made a U-turn in his ideological path, as it were. And we have a completely different. Imagine that those liberal hierarchs who lived 10, 15 years ago would just, be moved by time machine to our days, including the present patriarch himself. They would have been condemned by themselves nowadays. That's a paradox of this ideological development in Russia.
Very interesting. Thank you. And now Ben will ask the next question.
And so a question here from Veronica, who's asking, could you please give some examples that show that the contemporary Russian church tries to outsmart Putin's state?
Yeah. Just one sec. Yeah. Like for instance, it's you don't see it in the major policies. The major policies seem to be coherent with the policies of the Russian church. But essentially, for instance, if you take the ideology of the Russian world, the notorious ideology which underpins the policies of the present state in Russia, this ideology was created by the church, effectively, and it was sold to the state with the idea that the church was able to produce an ideology which is more consistent, more powerful, more capturing for the masses than the Putin's regime was able to produce before the Russian world emerged as an ideology. Because let us go back to to the early Putin's years. There was no ideology. Putin was not a charismatic figure. He's still not a charismatic figure. He was just, nothing in terms, of charisma, of, ideological vision, standing. Everything was produced by the state. And in this sense, the church was really more effective in producing an ideology than the state was. The only problem of the church is that the church doesn't have money and doesn't have, army and other resources, and that's where they cannot compete with one another. I do not want to go into much detail into internal struggles between the hierarchs and the figures in the presidential administration of Putin, but I can assure you there were struggles, there were tensions, and there were attempts, there were games. They played games trying to cheat one another. So underneath, as they say, it's an expression that the policy of Kremlin is defined by the battle of different towers of the Kremlin. There are different towers of the Kremlin, and they just fight each other. And certainly one of those towers, or one of those cupola also. There are cupola in the Kremlin, the church, which also contributes to this fight, internal fight in the structures of the Russian politics.
Thank you.
So now I have a question from Dr. Shovel, who's a professor at Tufts. So her question is, what factor or factors do you think best explain why so few UOC MP priests followed their parishes that voted to switch to OCU in Ukraine? Does it have to do with UOC MP ideologies in education, financial power consideration, some other set of factors?
Yeah. Well, I believe that the main factor that not necessarily maybe caused, but certainly triggered the establishment of the new autocephalous Ukrainian church with the support of the Ecumenical Patriarchate was the Russian aggression against Ukraine in the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity of 2014. The war that Russia waged against Ukraine and the ideological aggression primarily, not so much maybe, well, military and ideological aggressions, where the Russian church was weaponized, was used, just like Stalin used the church, to expand the Soviet ideology to the Middle East and East and Southern Europe. So Putin used the church for the same purpose. And people in Ukraine were so much upset about this instrumentalization of the church, and they had an option either to continue going to the church that endorses the Putin's aggression against Ukraine, or to leave the church altogether, or to go to the Greek Catholic Church, the third option. So that's why the option of having a recognized autocephalous church was needed, desperately needed, I believe for the pastoral reasons. Because people just abandoned the church in masses. And for those people who wanted to abandon the church, the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, which was the only legitimate canonical church at the time, the Ecumenical Patriarchate created a canonical church exactly to accommodate their religious demands, religious needs. So I believe that Ukrainian autocephaly was a response to the Russian aggression to a great extent. And many communities and people who switched to the new church did this exactly because they could not stomach the collaboration of the Moscow Patriarchate with the aggressive state of Russia.
Great, thank you. So now I'll move to Shelby, and I believe she has her own question to ask.
Yes, I do. I've been very interested in this since you mentioned sort of that you were focusing on the smaller dictatorships in Eastern and Southern Europe. Would you mind speaking a little bit about the former Yugoslavia and just, it wasn't a fascist dictatorship, but it did its kind of own brand of socialism. If you could speak about the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the state in that situation, I'd be very interested.
Yes, it's a very good question. There are many nuances in the relationship between, for instance, the regime of Slobodan Milosevic and the Serbian Orthodox Church. It's not easy. Well, after all, Slobodan Milosevic was an ex-communist. And he represented to the church the communist ideology to a great extent. And his vision of a greater Yugoslavia is not, it was partially a nationalistic vision, but it was also partially a Yugoslavian, a communist vision. And the church hesitated to wholeheartedly endorse Slobodan Milosevic. There were people, of course, in the church, within the church, who were completely with Slobo. But Patriarch Pavle at the time of the Serbian church was hesitant. And the church did not officially endorse the undertakings of Milosevic. But certainly the church became increasingly nationalistic and even fundamentalistic with the with the regimes that followed Milosevic, and with the people who supported Milosevic, but they were more in the nationalistic line, like Šešelj, for instance, or other kind of people who were really kind of 100% nationalists. The church supported nationalists, and the church still supports kind of imperial ambitions of Serbia, the countries like Montenegro or Northern Macedonia. But again, we are talking about an evolution We are talking about a process that 20 years ago, Serbia was different, and the Serbian church was quite different from what it is now. Nowadays, the Serbian society and the Serbian church, I think, especially the Serbian church, has been affected more profoundly by nationalism than it used to be even 20 years ago. That's my impression. That's why it's not a complete endorsement to the dictatorship. The dictatorship of Milosevic emerged immediately soon after the Soviet kind of communist era in after Yugoslavia, and the church was still hesitant about rudiments of communism, of communist ideology embodied in the program of Milosevic. But I believe the church is more endorsing the nationalistic undertakings, endeavors of the modern Serbian regime, even though formally it's not a dictatorship, but it's quite a nationalistic and quasi-imperial, it's quite tough. It's quite authoritarian, I would say. And the church is it seems to be completely aligning with it.
Thank you so much. That's very fascinating to me. Next, I believe we're going to have Dr. Shovel ask a follow-up question directly herself. So please go ahead, Dr. Shovel.
Dr. Shovel, I'm going to bring you in as a panelist. That way you can ask your question. I believe you can. There we go.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to clarify. I realize I typed abbreviations that maybe were not obvious. Thank you, Dr. Hovorun. What I wanted to ask was specifically the position of the priests who belong to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy, because very few of them followed with their parishes, right? Like it was some 600 parishes that switched to the newly established Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but really just a handful of priests went with their flock. So I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit more sort of motivations of the priests, because I talked to some people in Ukraine last summer and different things were mentioned, as in, including the type of education that people received, the kind of pressure that they came under, even family connections, because, that's often like a family like tradition and some, so I wonder if you can speak a little bit more of kind of the rank and file, if you were in the OCUNP. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for making your question more kind of clear to me. I didn't get, exactly and correctly what you wanted to ask. Yes, it's a very good question, and it's a complicated question. There are many reasons why many priests still stay in the Moscow Patriarchate. The reasons vary. Some of those reasons are indeed pressure and threats. Like for instance, just one. I will not name the priest, but I will mention the circumstances why what happened to him. He switched to the Orthodox Church, but his family was under such tremendous, huge pressure from other priests, not from the bishops, from the priests. Like for instance, they tried to persuade his wife that this priest is homosexual, that he is, which is still kind of a problem for many priests, and it's they consider it a kind of fault, and they forced in this way his wife to abandon the priest. They wanted essentially to destroy the family because he decided to switch to another church. Some other instruments, economic instruments like money, like blackmail, are used to force people to stay in the Moscow Patriarchate. It's very real. It's something that really happens. Also, in the Moscow Patriarchate, they created a narrative or narratives that say, for instance, that if you switch to another church, you will perish eternally. Your soul will, you will perish. You will go to Hades, to hell. If you switch there, you will essentially join a schism. They also cultivate an idea that if you stay in the Moscow Patriarchate, this is the only saving church. That is still the only church which gives you extra grace, and you have to stay there. So they essentially polarize the church. They render the situation in dualistic terms, black and white. If you stay with us, you will stay with the white side of the history, or of the the divide. If you go there, you will go, to hell, essentially. And this narrative, the narrative of hatred, hate speech, they apply a lot of hate speech. The narrative of hatred, of threats, of intolerance, it works. And it really keeps a lot of people in the Moscow Patriarchate. Also, the communities, the priests cannot leave, their communities. So if they cannot brainwash priests, they at least brainwash communities. And the communities want a priest who was thinking of switching to another church to stay in the Moscow Patriarchate. So there are many reasons, multiple reasons, multiple instruments of pressure, but most of them, they are coercive instruments of brainwashing, of forcing people to stay. It's not a free choice, well thought, they cannot follow freely their choice. That is the problem.
Thank you.
I think I'll hand it over to you, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much, Francois. I have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Hovorun. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about another state actor that's been missing from the story. As we know, during the Cold War, the United States was very actively engaged with all churches in the ecumenical movement, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and all their national, sort of expressions, along with Muslim communities as well in the fight against communism. And as we also know, since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been engaged supporting, a language of religious freedom and freedom of conscience and belief, etc. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit from your perspective about whether U.S. engagement, certainly in the Cold War period, but now in the post-Cold War period, whether it's exercised a democratizing influence and support for progressive voices in the Orthodox world, or whether it has unintentionally generated internal tensions that have reinforced conservative and fundamentalist voices.
Yeah, yes, it's a good question again. I think I'm not in a good position to to evaluate the real involvement of the United States in the developments in the Orthodox world. There is certainly an involvement, some kind of involvement. There is a policy which is applied and implemented, including regarding the Ukrainian autocephaly. I don't know exactly to what degree it applies. What I can say is how it is perceived in Russia, in the Russian church, and in Ukraine by the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. It has become a major kind of a red rug or a major argument against the Ukrainian autocephaly. And as I mentioned, that there is a narrative that has been developed by different means, through different means of propaganda, including the Russian state propaganda, that has demonized, the Ukrainian autocephalous church and has demonized the ecumenical patriarchate. The ecumenical patriarchate has been placed in the rhetoric of the bishops of the Russian church and the Ukrainian church, among the heretics and the schismatics and the worst people in the church history. They used really nasty words. So the United States also holds a central place in this pantheon of demonic forces from the perspective of the Russian propaganda. And they say, you see, the Ukrainian autocephaly was created by the State Department, US State Department. This is purely a construction, a creature. This monster is a creature of the American foreign policy of the United States. What can be good being created by the United States? And they say, if you want to join this political project of the United States, you could go, which is a form of pressure, of course. And it's a manipulation, certainly. So they certainly exaggerate the role of the United States. Well, honestly, I wish the United States would have played the same role that it is ascribed by those forces, in promoting autocephaly. But certainly they place the United States as the main figure, and they develop conspiracy theories where they place the United States as the main actor behind the scene, well, particularly behind the scene of the Ukrainian autocephaly. They also say that, you see, the ecumenical patriarchate is completely, he is a marionette of the United States. And they come from the presupposition, which is intrinsic for the Orthodox churches, which I've already mentioned, this kind of symphonic thinking. They assume that every single church has to have a political partner in the Orthodox world. The Russian church has Putin, right? Many churches in the Orthodox ecumene endorse the Russian church and Putin because they consider that Putin is a legitimate, kind of reliable partner. He's an Orthodox political partner for the church. The ecumenical patriarchate, they assume, also should have a partner because otherwise it doesn't work. I mean, in the Orthodox church, every church has to have a political partner. And who's the political partner of the ecumenical patriarchate? Of course, it is the United States, the president of the United States. That's how they extrapolate their kind of symphonic thinking to the policies of the ecumenical patriarchate. There should be a political player that pushes the ecumenical patriarchate to do this or that, and that is the United States. This is clearly a conspiracy theory. It's our Orthodox brand of conspiracy theories, and it's interesting that an American politician who is notorious for producing conspiracy theories, is a main figure in these Orthodox conspiracy theories. It's a funny game. So that is the explanation. That is the role of the United States. It is perceived as central. It does not necessarily mean that it is central. I believe it is not central, but it is perceived in this way in Russia and actually by many in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. This another player, a mythical player, which is perceived in the same way, is Vatican, quite surprisingly. I had a chance some time ago, several years ago, I think it was 2015, to talk to a Greek metropolitan, probably quite enlightened, open-minded, educated Greek metropolitan, and I asked him, "What do you think about the Ukrainian, events?" And I meant the Maidan, the Revolution Dignity. The Ukrainian autocephaly did not happen yet. And his answer was, of course, it is the Vatican. It is the Pope who is to be blamed for everything. So we are very easy to sleep to, in the Orthodox churches, to slide to conspiracy theories. We can find all those, mythical creatures behind the scenes, like the American president or the Pope. They are not, of course, but they are perceived in this way.
Thank you very much. And thank you for emphasizing something that came up in another one of our presentations earlier this week. Dima Adamski spoke. He was hosted by the Russian Eurasia program, and we co-hosted him. But the issue of sort of echo chambers and the media, and I would say under the rubric of sharp power and cyber warfare, that kind of perception that you just outlined in the narrative, the way that that plays itself out through various echo chambers using cyber tools. And also in the case of Russia, I think there's been a very active effort inside Turkey to play that out and amplify that narrative inside Turkey as well, with the NATO-Turkey kind of disruption, Russia-Turkey disruption vis-a-vis NATO. But we're beginning to see how it is that hybrid warfare and cyber tools are being used as effectively by churches and other faith traditions as they are by states. So thank you for sort of
Exactly. I can probably lead you to a series of publications by Associated Press. You can Google their publication. They published a series of articles of investigation. There was a journalist from the Associated Press who made an investigation into the Russian cyber activities, and actually he found, with the assistance of some cyber groups, that several constituencies where groups were attacked by the same Russian cyber groups, including American U.S. military personnel, high-ranked, including political groups, especially among the Democrats, and the ecclesial groups, including the environmental, the ecumenical patriarch, and then some top officials in the Orthodox Church in the United States. So they were treated in the same way as the political and military groups in the United States by the Russian hackers.
Yeah. I see RJ has he's saying, what was the resource you just mentioned? There was a lot of reporting, RJ, in the New York Times, but it was Fancy Bear, the
Exactly.
infamous Russian hacking group, that has hacked U.S. Citizens, private citizens, but also government agencies. They also hacked the ecumenical patriarchates.
Exactly. The name of the journalist who made the investigation is Raphael Sutter. He's a Paris-based British journalist, and he works for the Associated Press. He made the investigation. Raphael Sutter.
Yeah, and so for those of you who do things, on the cyber side, I mean, looking at the way in which all sorts of platforms, just communication platforms like Signal and Telegram, are used for recruiting and sharing, ideas across transnational religious ideas. This is an inter-religious, comparative set of developments, and it's not limited to. We hear a lot about it in terms of radicalization in Islam. It's not limited to Islam, and in fact, all faith traditions have their own and are developing more and more their own capabilities using the cyberspace and cyber tools in order to promote their message and to use platforms to compete with one another, both across faith tradition lines, but within particular denominational groups as well.
Exactly. Unfortunately, the church religion has become an instrument of the new tools of the Russian influence, including the influence in the United States. Certainly, well, it's not just a tale by the Democrats that there is an influence and an attempt to exercise an impact on the political developments in the United States, and the church is a part of those events, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I think we've come to the end of the program, and thank you, Father Doctor. I never know whether to call you Father or Doctor, so I'll call you both, Father Doctor.
Just call me Cyril. It's enough.
Okay. Thank you for being with us, and thank you also, Professor Shovel, for joining in. It's great to see you on screen.
Thank you.
Thank you to the student leadership of RLD and for all listeners, and thank you for allowing us to sort of pepper you with questions. We really appreciate your willingness to sort of drill down into deeper analysis. So thank you very much, and I think we've recorded you, and this session will be uploaded to the website, and we look forward to welcoming you in a PC environment, meaning post-COVID environment, real time to the Fletcher School.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you to everybody.